Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and tonight we are here to celebrate Mary Soon Lee's latest book, How to Navigate Our Universe. A charming book, and she's going to be sharing some excerpts with it from us, for us, rather. And then we'll move on to the interview section later. If anyone has any questions at any point, please do drop those in the chat, and we will try to get to them all. And also, please do keep yourself muted throughout the event. That way we don't interrupt the wonderful poetry. Mary Soon Lee was born and raised in London, but has lived in Pittsburgh for 30 years. She is a Grand Master of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, and once upon a time earned a degree in mathematics from Cambridge University. Her work has appeared in a wide range of publications, including American Scholar, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and Science. She also has an online presence, which is the cryptically named website, marysoonlee.com, which I will be putting in the chat in a moment there. Be sure to visit so you can get this wonderful new book. I'm going to hand it over to Mary to share some poetry with us.
Thank you very much for coming. So I am indeed going to read poems from this collection, which mostly consists of quirky how-to poems with a space-related theme. And I'm going to start with several from part one of the book, which is about our stellar backyard, our solar system. How to tease Jupiter. Pretend you only dropped by for a chat with Callisto. Gossip about her sister moons until Jupiter interrupts. If he asks how he's looking, keep staring at his red spot. Tell him to tighten his belts, that his equator is bulging. Then ignore his indignation, his inordinate tempests. Remark that manners, not mass, are the measure of a planet. Before you leave, make amends. We only tease those we love. So that poem first appeared in Upagus. I think it's 55 of the poems in the book were published somewhere else first, and the rest were original to the collection. So I like to credit the places that were kind enough to publish me. And tonight's poems, some of them first appeared in Upagus, newmyths.com, Spillway, Eye to the Telescope, Triangulation Dark Skies, and Louisiana Literature. So I have fulfilled my obligation. Now I don't have to feel guilty. How to colonize Ganymede. Let humans scratch the surface of this moon larger than Mercury, planting their flags, posturing. Beneath his icy surface, a buried breadth of oceans, layer on liquid layer. Save those for the whales. Let them bring light. Let them sing. And we move on to Saturn. How to surprise Saturn. Praise his thrift, turning ice, rock, dust to homespun necklaces. He'll thank you, then wait with resigned dignity for you to rhapsodize about those rings. Do not. Look at him instead. Admire his supple shape, his pastel palette. Continuing outward, how to overlook Uranus. Ignore those lacking labels with a superlative seal, those neither first nor last, neither largest nor least. Ignore those on the periphery who take a sideways view, those who speak up rarely, weighing each soft word. How to decorate the moon. No banners, no balloons, no gaudy gilded gazebos. No neon lights, no temples, no towering triumphal arches. Instead, on the far side, an array of radio antennae, shielded from Earth's babble, our ears on the universe. On the near side, minimalist, the 6 Apollo landing sites, faded flags and footprints beneath a canopy of stars. So some of the poems actually rhyme, and here are 3 of those. How to glimpse the Icarus star. Cast Hubble high into the sky, peer through his mirrored eye. Let gravity augment his sight, massed galaxies lensing light. Across 9 billion years of night, the image of a star takes flight. A star, a single blue hot star from almost unimaginably far. Nicknamed Icarus for a boy whose fame outlived his joy. Hubble's portrait so very old, the star itself long dead and cold. How to navigate our universe. Not by compass or polar star, neither able to steer you far. Not by fickle constellations adrift without foundations. Not by sight, not by any light when you pilot the sea of night. Hold hard the helm, and for your guide, take the tug of gravity's tide. Left by matter, seen and unseen, dark energy, its hidden queen. The warp and weft that fold the sky, bending space-time as you sail by. How to observe the Horsehead Nebula. Do not replay the same dark horse, the same perspective others dealt. Aim Hubble's wide field camera near Alnitak, Orion's belt. The old made new in infrared, the horse's head now dusky rose, a prima donna girt with stars, preening in picture-perfect pose. Or shut your eyes and journey back to Boston, 1888, where Wilhelmina Fleming peers at a photographic plate. Tired, perhaps, or missing Scotland, dreaming thoughts above her station, abandoned wife, single mother, first to see that indentation. So back to non-rhyming poems, which some, even some members of my family, might say are therefore hardly poems at all. How to blush like Beetlejuice. Summon shame, humiliation, your most embarrassing moment. That serves as a beginning, but cannot match the big guy. Unbelt, float yourself until you stretch past Mars. Shout loud your failings, every devastating detail. There, that reddened glow, so fierce you will explode. How to drink water. Gratefully, mindfully, remembering its source, reservoirs, rivers, rain, a gift of the clouds. And before that, further and further, how hydrogen formed in the hot aftermath of the Big Bang. First, singular protons, then their pairing with electrons, then the mustering of hosts of hydrogen and helium in stellar furnaces, where fusion's assembly line marshaled heavier atoms, resulting, among others, in oxygen, atomic number 8. How oxygen volunteered to join hydrogen in water molecules, how that water infiltrated the gas and dust that made our sun, our solar system, our earth of dirt, sea, streams, springs. The enormity of that tour of duty before ever you thought to pour it in a glass or cup it in your hand to drink. So quite a few of the poems are about astronomers and other space-related pioneers, and here's a few. How to Look Far. In memory of Galileo Galilei, February 15, 1564 to January 8, 1642. Select spherical glass surfaces in curves, convex and concave. Position paired lenses precisely, bending light to your bidding. Peering through this instrument, map the mountains of the moon, reveal the concealed satellites of Jupiter, unfixed, restless, their circling paths disclosing the ordering of the firmament. No matter what ignorance insists, banish lies, let there be light. How to Illuminate, in memory of Henrietta Swan Leavitt, July 4th, 1868 to December 12th, 1921. Softly, gently, a candle gleam outshone by bolder lighthouse beam. Take your place in Pickering's hoard. Female helpers he could afford to carry out astronomy with laudable economy. Softly, meticulously note the facts on Cepheids remote. Softly ponder and then conclude period scales with magnitude. Softly, and yet, until your light, we had no measure of the night. How to Help Hubble. In memory of Edwin Hubble, November 20th, 1889 to September 28th, 1953. Fetch him offerings of mice, lizards, birds, a dragonfly for his amusement. Sprawl atop his papers to prevent him pondering pointless extraplanetary topics. Sleep at the foot of his bed, except that one last time when you curl beside him. After he has receded too far, too fast to follow, watch for him at the window. Copernicus's cat. After her master failed to acknowledge that the celestial spheres revolved round her, the cat, understandably, left home. And I'm going to end with the last poem in the book, which is about my daughter, as she was years ago when I wrote it, because this is one of the oldest poems. Holding You. In the dark, I lifted you out of sleepiness into my arms, school ahead of you, but for the minute that I carried you down the stairs to breakfast, you were a larger version of your toddler self, your head on my shoulder, your limbs still floppy. The universe so vast that if I walked for 7 years, I wouldn't even reach the moon. The sun 3,000 years beyond that, and the next nearest star 800 million years away. And in that vastness of length, only I had the privilege of holding you. So thank you very much. And that is the end of the reading section.
Thank you so much for sharing those with us, Mary. It's absolutely lovely to hear those in your voice after reading the book. So we're going to move into the interview segment. If anyone has any questions, please do feel free to drop those in the chat as we progress through the event. So for starters, I wanted to ask you about science poetry versus speculative poetry, how these things hold hands, how they're different, and about the ongoing relationship between the sciences and poetry. Many scientists throughout history have also been poets. They share mathematics and so forth.
Well, for me at least, there's definitely a very soft border. When I write poetry that I think of as science poetry, I very, very often anthropomorphize things. So the planets have personalities and so on. What I aspire to is something where it makes people feel a sense of wonder or an increased interest in science from reading the poem, and to contain some, not every poem, but some of them to contain some factoids that are actually pieces of current science. I can't really speak to the to the larger question of what, I mean, I'm not a scientist. I don't know. I mean, I know some scientists, but I don't really know how they regard science. Hmm, well, I mean, so my astronomer friend who, or there are two of them, who proofread the collection for me were kind enough to say they like it, but that's not really. And I did recently read another collection of astronomy-based poetry. It's actually, I have it here. It's called Beyond Earth's Edge, the Poetry of Space Flight, which someone gave me as a gift. And it contains poetry about space flight and space, some of it by very well-known poets like W.H. Auden, Pablo Neruda, and some of it by science fiction poets, and some of it by poets who may be well known, but who in my ignorance I'd never heard of before. And there were some by astronauts as well. It's interesting to see. And I have noticed that, like, is it Scientific American? But some publications are including poetry that are really primarily science places, but they have some science-related poetry in there as well.
So you mentioned anthropomorphizing the celestial bodies. Um, Space is so vast, infinite, that it can be very difficult and abstract to wrap your head around. And I wondered if this is why you often reach towards anthropomorphizing the subject, or if there are other reasons behind this.
I think I like to anthropomorphize things. I wrote short fiction before I wrote poetry, and um, yeah, a couple of those stories are about objects that have personalities and so on. It's just a very easy thing for me to slip into. I don't know when it first began, maybe when I had stuffed toys when I was very small and I felt that they ought to have a personality, or that they did have a personality, one or the other.
Here's one from Richard in the audience. Could you give us a glimpse at the timeline from writing the first of these poems to being inspired to putting them together into a collection?
So the final section of the book has poems that aren't how-to poems, and some of those were written before the collection was anything I ever contemplated doing, and so they're older. I think I want to say maybe like 2009 or something. 2007 is the oldest poem in that section. But the main section of it, I made a note somewhere in case this question came up. Now I have to find the note. But yes, in 2017, based on a writing prompt in this book, I wrote some quirky how-to poems, which it was suggesting. And the one poem was a 3-line poem in this collection called How to Be a Star. And I wrote it among a series of other things like how to destroy a dragon, how to be invisible. And then in 2018, I went back and wrote some more how-to poems. I think I began with maybe the Mercury one. And then I thought, well, if I can do Mercury, then why not do all the planets? And when I'd done all the planets, I thought, I just kind of kept going until we're interspersed with other things. So I didn't write this in one solid block, which I have done with some writing projects. I wrote, poems as they occurred to me until I decided it was done.
Can you tell us a little bit about your process of doing research for science and astronomy poems? And also, does this differ when you're writing fiction versus poetry?
Well, the science poetry that I've written, I have often decided I'd like to write a poem about a particular subject. In particular, before this, I wrote poems for the elements of the periodic table, and I decided I would write one for each element. And it turns out that I didn't know a lot of detail about all 118 elements, so I necessarily found myself going out to look up facts. and then looking for ones that interested me and so on. With this book, some of the things, I mean, so I've been interested in space ever since I can remember. And I did study astronautics and space engineering for whatever that's worth for, before I came to the United States. I did an MSc. And so I have books on my shelves that I read 30 years ago or more than 30 years ago that ultimately were part of the backdrop against which I wrote this. And you know, either directly or indirectly crept in, but there were also, once I realized I was going to write a sizable number of these poems, I, you know, I went out and read some more books just to not this is different than doing research towards a particular poem. It's to have a set of things that I can draw on, a sort of a more breadth of information. But then, you know, when it comes to a particular poem, especially if there are distances or something involved, I'm going to go and check it either in a book I have or on the great wide internet, with, you know, helpful sites like NASA providing opportunities to check everything. So
That touches a little bit on my next question. I wonder how your background in mathematics has influenced your writing of poetry. Um, and do you ever apply any of the devices from mathematics into the meter, for instance?
I don't write much metered poetry. I'm I can for me that's very difficult. It's harder than rhyme. I like it. Like but I don't do it much. I do something that's much more arithmetic in my mind, in that I do syllabic poetry where you're counting syllables like haiku, or just every line will have 8 syllables, you know, which the reader might not notice. But I actually think often if there's a form that the reader doesn't see, but that you have in your mind, it makes you spend longer over the writing process, and just spending longer over it makes you more thoughtful or forces you to rearrange stuff and rethink stuff. Um, and sometimes that helps. Sometimes it helps me at least. As for mathematics more generally, I mean, I've written a couple of, I mean, more than a couple, but not a ton, of poems that I thought drew upon mathematics, but normally not. Normally, that seems like a past section of my life. I don't know. And also hard. I mean, the things that I liked best in mathematics were elegant proofs and so on. And I could try and write a poem which contained one of them, but I don't think it would appeal to almost anybody. And you couldn't do anything but a very simple, elegant proof there. So I don't know.
Now I want to see what that looks like, even if it doesn't have appeal for the masses. Here's a two-part question from the audience. This one's from Rebecca. Can you talk about the inspiration for the persona you created for Saturn? Also, as a poet, who have you learned from? Who have been your teachers and inspirations?
Well, let me not forget the second part. Um, so basically, all the poetry I've read, starting when I was 7, a family friend gave me the Oxford Book of English Verse, which is a very grown-up book for a 7-year-old, but I was, I think, flattered that she had given it to me instead of sort of, I don't know, here comes Spot or something. So I plowed my way slowly through it, and I don't remember most of those poems. I mean, it starts way back before English was fully English. You know, the language itself is a barrier. But you know, so from then onward, I suppose there was some kind of foundation, most of which I don't remember the details of now. I mean, I remember individual poems. For instance, I loved The Lady of Shalott, which is a relatively long poem, and I learned it by heart because I was so, I was like, I was like a little kid. I still am a little kid for that particular poem because I can't get rid of my sort of amazement, at how well it has meter and it's just nice and nice and nice and it goes along, it tells the story. And then at the end, the last verse, but Lancelot mused a little space. He said, she has a lovely face. God in his mercy, lend her grace, the Lady of Shalott. When he's basically the reason that she's now dead. And I was just like, oh, that's amazing. So, I'm trying to think. Another poet that at the time I read, I didn't realize was going to be influential on me, but I think I credit them for it, was Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She wrote some, I think, still reasonably widely read sonnets from the Portuguese, which are love poems. And then she also wrote a novel-length poem called Aurora Lee in English, and it's a narrative poem. And some of it, I just loved particular bits of it. But the thing that was influential was it was the first time I had realized you could write a really lengthy poem in modern or semi-modern. She's not contemporary, but she's not ancient English poetry. I had read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a little bit of one little bit of the Odyssey, even in Greek, and I'd read the Aeneid, a little bit of that in Latin, and so on. But I hadn't understood. This is again when I was young, though not as young as 7. I mean, more like a teenager. I hadn't understood that yes, you could still do that. So I think that also had an impact on me. And there were lots and lots of other poets that I like, but those are some things that I think had an influence. Then there was the question about Saturn. I might be, if I went back to my notes, I might be able to say something about why specifically. I think I didn't want the poem itself to revolve around the fact that he has rings, or that Saturn has rings. I wanted to encourage people to think about what's next, what else is there? So that's all. Just to imagine Saturn being patient but fed up in a patient way with the fact that that's always what people think about.
So obviously this is a themed collection. Elemental Haiku was as well. How does your process differ when putting together a themed collection versus working on standalone poems? And how do you know when you're going to be able to extract a book-length manuscript out of a theme?
Well, with the periodic table, I just knew exactly how long the project was. I didn't know whether or not it was going to be publishable as a book. That was definitely all thanks to my agent. It was published in Science, and then she managed to resell it to a book publisher, for which she deserves enormous credit, because it's really not very many words, because they're all so short. With this one, I didn't in the beginning know that it would be the length of a book length collection. I just thought of it as a set of poems. And then they grew to be a large set of poems. And I realized, well, okay, so they could be a book. And I have some sequences at the moment that are not book length, but they're not negligible. And I've considered, maybe, and when I say not book length, they would be the length of a chapbook, a small poetry book that gets put out, but not the length of a book that you would expect to see on a bookshelf. But if I assembled, more than one of these sets together, they could be, but I'm not, that's further down the road. They're not complete. That is to say, I haven't run out of desire to add to them. And with this one, I did, in terms of selecting poems to write. So in the beginning, I was just writing whatever occurred to me, but then later I tried to, fill in some things to, when I decided I was going to write a section on pioneers, I tried to go back a little way in time, and and so on.
And how did you choose which particular stars? I mean, obviously there's so many, but you've narrowed that down to specifics.
just I would sit down and either there would be one that I'd already been thinking about. I mean, the Icarus star, for instance, is a very particular star with an interesting fact about it. Or, you know, or I would just, I mean, my cat, he's slightly in the picture. I just sit down with my cat when I'm trying to decide what to write, and I kind of scribble things down, and then in some sort of unclear way, one idea out of several possibilities becomes the one that I'm interested in writing. So I might have started off, with notes on a bunch of constellations or a bunch of stars, and then decided, okay, so I'll write a poem about Rigel or something.
And I've noticed in this particular collection, the majority of the poems are written in couplets or terces. And I wonder if this is a deliberate choice. Do you decide this before you sit down to write the poem? And why so many of the poems favor these stanza lengths?
I don't decide before I'm going to write the poem, unless it is actually a form poem, which is rare. There are a couple of pantoums in there and so on, but unless it has a deliberate form, it happens usually very early in writing the poem. I realize that I'm going to put it into couplets or put it into whatever form it finally has, but it's not before I actually begin. And sometimes I rearrange it as I'm going. This morning I was writing a poem and I thought it was going to have a certain form, and then I kept rearranging it and moving it around, and in the end it was 7 lines, which was much shorter than the number of lines I had written, but I was left with 7, and they were just one stanza, without any, it just, so it's not usually something I pre-plan, but yes, in this case, a lot of them fell out into couplets. And it may have been that there was a sort of momentum, because some of them were in couplets and I had been doing couplets. It just made me continue. But they're not all. So there you go. It's just,
Yeah, certainly not all of the poems, but I did notice that there seemed to be a
there's a lot.
preference for that. And was there a reason when you leaned away from that preference? I noticed later in the book, particularly when talking about astronomers and stuff, then that sort of form changed a bit.
I don't think there was a reason that I'm aware of what it was, but there may have been some underlying reason why that caused me to do it. But it's part of a process that I haven't brought to my conscious mind. I don't know. I mean, I could look at the poem titles and think about. I don't know why. Well, the final poems were written over a span of time and less with an eye to the collection. So that final 5th section is generally assorted. But before that, they were all written sort of in the era of writing the astronomy collection.
I noticed also that another device that can be found in quite a few of the poems is the use of alliteration. And I wonder when you decide to reach for it versus not reaching for it, if that's a conscious choice, and what effect you feel that it has. I know people have mixed feelings about alliteration.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can feel silly. It didn't feel silly in this particular collection. So I wondered your thoughts on that device.
I like alliteration. I fall into the I like alliteration category. All I would say is if I notice that I'm doing it in a particular poem, I'm likely to do more in that particular poem. Not just have one pair of lines which is all alliterative and then the rest of it not. But I think, like the couplets, it happens as I'm writing the first few lines, which might not end up being the first few lines, but in that process where I'm starting to write a poem, lots of things get constrained. I actually think this about much longer things of mine, like stories as well, or even the novel length poem work that I have. I didn't realize when I was writing the beginning of that book how much little things would influence the later sections, but everything you do shapes what's going to follow. So, you know, in a poem, if I start with alliteration, I may continue. In the book length epic fantasy thing, then in the first poem, you know, there's a dragon, he likes the main character is a young boy who and his horse is mentioned a couple of times. And I hadn't planned out anything else, but horses become a theme that runs through you know, everything just influences the choices that you're going to make later on. So that's all. I wish I could say I guess for writing fiction, there are people who plot and people who are called pantsers. And so I guess I would say that as a poet, I'm a bit of a pantser. I don't really pre-plan things, but I do try to let them sort of be consistent with what is already written, you know, to give them some kind of shape or whatever.
When revising your work, if you notice these patterns developing, is that something that you will attempt to accentuate or tame down if you feel there's too much? How does the revision process work for you?
Well, I often read things aloud. I if there's rhyme and it's not humorous, and the poem is not humorous, I try to make it comparatively, I mean, not so that you wouldn't notice it, but so that it doesn't really draw attention to itself. In humorous poetry, I think it's absolutely fine to rhyme two silly words together. But but for something that's not humorous, I don't always succeed. With everything, I don't always succeed. But yeah. And then, you know, other revision, you know, if something doesn't sound right, and considering changing where the beginning is, deleting, adding verses, deleting, adding individual words, and the ever agonizing dilemmas over punctuation, whether to capitalize words, whether to put in commas, which commas to put in, which commas to take out. Uh, yes, I think punctuation and layout on the page is a big thing that I do fiddle with, and then I put it back the way it was, and then I fiddle with it again. Anyway, and then it's not necessarily satisfactory. As in, it's not necessarily the way that anybody who published it publishes it once. FNSF, for instance, I am very aware she does not like commas at the end of lines. She will remove every comma at the end of the line and say it's unnecessary. You know, just the fact that there's a line end, you don't need a comma. But I feel that some line ends do need commas in my heart of hearts. So
I tend to agree, and I don't know if we read poetry this way anymore, but the punctuation adds a certain number of beats, so
mhm,
there is a timing issue there.
mhm.
Um, Back to humor for a second. There are some humorous pieces in the book, and humor is notoriously difficult to write. It doesn't always translate, for instance. But when writing a humorous piece, is this something you're setting out to do? Is this something that requires revision? How do you decide when or when not it's working to do a humorous piece?
I find humorous poetry very hard to write. Um, I often, if I write a humorous poem that has 10 lines in it, it might take me 10 times as long as a 30-line poem that's serious. And yet I'm often dissatisfied with the outcome. Um, I think it's good to try. I think it's good for there to be humor. I like reading humorous things myself, but I find it hard, well, just as I find many things hard. So, um, I mean, I do. I mean, I sit down in the morning with my cat and I say to myself, well, today it would be nice to write something humorous. And I say it to myself, and then I look at the things that I'm going to look at to maybe give, like these writing prompt books or whatever I have, or old notes from the previous day to think about what I might write. And I think, well, can I, is something humorous coming to my mind? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's terrible, and sometimes it's okay. It's much less reliable for me than trying to write a non-humorous poem.
Well, you got some chuckles out of me, and I know how difficult it can be. So I applaud you there. So aside from writing poetry, you're also a wonderful writer of fiction. And I wonder when you reach for one versus the other. And something I often do that I'm really curious if others attempt this as well is when you have an idea, do you try it out as a poem and as a story? Do you ever, or in the other direction there? Yeah, when do you reach for poetry versus fiction to tell the story you have to tell?
Okay, so the actual reason that I shifted from mostly fiction to mostly poetry was that when my second child was born, the daughter from that last poem, I had very little free time and I could not sort of, I couldn't squirrel away enough time to think about something to write a short story. That first year after she was born, I think I wrote 10 poems and the whole year, and maybe 11. And they weren't necessarily long poems. And that was just because sometimes, my husband would be looking after her and William would be, otherwise occupied. He was at kindergarten. So, I would I would sit down and I wasn't so exhausted that I couldn't write something and I had time to write something and I could finish a poem because I wanted to complete it because it might have been a week before I next got to sit down. So I wrote poems and that continued for a bunch of years after she was born, that poems were what I thought I could squeeze in. And I was able to write more poems. I mean, more than 10 a year, but still I was doing poems. And then I started doing some short stories again, but I'm still predominantly doing poetry because I found out that I liked writing poetry. It's like, it's one of these things I never planned to write. Then I found, oh, I like writing fiction. I'd like to continue. And then I found, oh, I like writing poetry. I'd like to continue. So um, my husband has dropped a thing in there about sound in the chat. Sounds like a very good husband. I will say, if you want to write poetry, it's really helpful to have somebody with a good income who will fund you.
Yes, the lucrative world of poetry. I'm sure a lot of our audience is familiar with this. Um, so you talk about time constraints, yet you have written novel-length poems. How does that process work?
I wrote it one poem at a time. I didn't intend to get into it. I just wrote the first poem. And then it really pulled at me. For a start, it was shortly after I had allowed myself to return to writing fantasy and science fiction, which for some reason, after my daughter was born, I wrote mainstream poetry. I mean, and it wasn't all about my children. I wrote just general mainstream poetry. And then I wrote a few fantasy poems and I realized, whoa, this is somehow incredibly satisfying. And when I wrote the first poem in what would become The Sign of the Dragon, it was just an extremely enjoyable writing experience for me. And so I went back and I wrote some more poems about the same character. And then I got really caught up in it. And even when I was supposed to be, folding laundry or whatever, I would think about it. But I was able to write each little episodic bit, and they're not like Aurora Lee. There are gaps, there's a poem about something, and then the next poem might be 3 months later or about a different character or from another point of view. So they were written as just here's one piece. Although, yeah, as I got further into it, it became more narrative as it went on. I mean, there was always a narrative, but it became more of a plotted piece as it went on.
What made you gravitate towards speculative poetry in the first place? You were named
Tim.
Grandmaster not that long ago, so obviously it's a big part of your life. But why spec po versus mainstream poetry?
Well, the first poems I wrote seriously, trying to get them published, were mostly mainstream. But Tim Assayas, who I see there, he was part of a workshop that I ran, and it was primarily for fiction, but he brought in poetry, and it was a speculative fiction writers group. We were writing science fiction and fantasy, and he brought in science fiction and fantasy poems. So I blame Tim.
Well, thank you for that.
Or
um,
I thanked him, but I can blame him.
so what are you currently working on, and what's coming up next for you? Is there another book in the works? Is there going to be more fiction, or is it going to be focused on poetry?
Well, so I was diagnosed with cancer in 2022, and during the treatment, which has now ended, I did write I wrote a poetry project, which was autobiographical and therefore unlike anything else that I've done. And my agent has said she would like to try and sell it, but I don't think she's actually tried to sell it yet. There's this, anyhow. Uh, so it may or may not ever see the light of day, and it may or may not ever see publication. If I don't know. But I guess it's pretty different. It's haiku, but it's pretty different in that they are, as I say, one after the other and themed because they were to do with this experience, and autobiographical. So it's not like the rest. Most of the time at the moment, I sit down in the morning and if I'm trying to write at all, and I think, well, I'd like to write a poem. I'd like it to be brilliant. And then I get rid of that. I'd like it to be brilliant because that's disastrous. I can't put that on myself. I just think, okay, so I'd like to write a poem. Maybe I'd like to write a poem about a cat. That's because the cat's there. And then I think, have I done a lot of cat poems recently? And then I move on to the next thought. So there are some sequences. There's a poem, I'm going to forget. It's about Nebraska. Oh my God, what's the title? Anyhow, they're following. This is very bad that I can't remember the actual title. Okay, it's called something like "So This Is Nebraska" is the poem, and I wrote maybe 10 poems that are like that. One is "So This Is Neptune," and then I have a lot of poems, far more than 10, which I'm still gradually expanding, that are what they're reading poems, what aliens read, what trolls read, and so on. And there are a whole slew of those poems that are getting added to occasionally. But a lot of them are standalone poems. That poem, by the way, is by Ted Kuza. So This Is Nebraska. And he has also written, as well as a lot of excellent poetry. He's a poet I like very much. He has a how to write poetry book, or it's called the Poetry Home Repair Manual. I think that's right. It's close to that, if not. And it's a good, very good short book with thoughts on writing poetry.
I didn't want to ask till you brought it up, but the reading poems I love, and I hope that turns into a broader collection because those have been a lot
Thank
of
you.
fun to read. One more question from the audience. This one's from Denise. Will you be going to Worldcon in Glasgow this year?
The answer is probably not. And the reason is because I've not traveled overseas since the beginning of the pandemic. And although I actually hope to do so next year, I have some relatives I have cousins in Glasgow, but I have relatives that are more important that I see. I have a son, I have a sister and her son, my nephew in London, whom I ought to see, and I have an aunt in Dublin and an aunt and cousins in Singapore. And the aunt in Dublin has cousins too, but the two aunts are not young, and I would like to try and see them. I don't think I'm going to get it all done next year. I think trying to do Glasgow as well would be just definitely too much. So I hope to at least see some of my relatives, and that will probably have to be foreign travel for next year.
Well, hopefully in 2025 we can all see each other in Seattle.
Yeah, that sounds manageable. Yeah.
Mary, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your work with us. Thank you so much to our audience for coming. If you don't have it yet, Mary Soon Lee, How to Navigate Our Universe, a brilliant read. You can get that at her website, which I've linked to here in the chat. Thank you so much, everybody.
I just want to thank you, Jean-Paul, and everybody who came and listened, but also very much to Jean-Paul for hosting this and inviting me to do it in the first place. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Anything to help poets and writers. Good night, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.